Color can make or break your product, and I mean that quite literally. I've designed dozens of color palettes over the years, some good, some not so good, and I decided to kind of dissect some of the best color palettes in tech products, as well as my own process that I've honed over the years, and come up with this in-depth guide to UI colors. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. I'm Maddie if you're new. I am a product designer and currently the design lead for a small tech startup called Bubble. And here on YouTube, I make videos about design and productivity. So if you're into those things and you want to see weekly videos from me, feel free to hit subscribe. We have a lot to go through in this video, so enough with the intro, let's get right into it. This video is going to cover two main parts. The first is actually crafting the color palette, and the second is implementing it. So when it comes to crafting a palette for a UI, what colors do you actually need? I like to think about this as my primary and secondary colors. The primary colors are going to consist of my brand color, and I might have one or two brand colors. This is a color that has a bit more personality. Maybe it's a brighter color. And the other two primary colors are going to be a really light color and a really dark color. These light and darks should be more neutral and receding to let the brand color or colors show through and shine a bit more. Your secondary colors are just that. They are second to your primary colors, but they are important to define ahead of time. A lot of times my secondary colors are a slightly darker version of my lighter primary color and a slightly lighter version of my darker primary color. And we'll talk about that more when we get to the implementing section, but let's go a little bit deeper on those primary and secondary colors. So first, let's talk about the dark and the light primary neutral colors. My first tip here is to never use true white or true black, especially true black, because these are a little bit straining on the eye. Shades of gray can work, but it's actually even more interesting to add maybe a little bit of color into your blacks and whites. For example, our color palette at Bubble includes this dark color, which is a deep indigo, and this light color, which I call barely lavender. Notice how both of them have the blue-purple tone to them, so they complement each other really well, even though they're definitely contrasting. Now let's talk about your brand colors. So if you're kind of building a product or a brand from scratch, then you have the power to define these, or at least to have some say in what they might be. So if that's the case, make sure to do some research on the colors being used in your specific industry or product market. People love putting things into categories. That's just how our brains function. So if we're able to use color in order to group a new product in with products that we're already aware of, that helps us understand what that product might do. But that being said, make sure not to choose the exact brand color of one of your competitors. Try to have your color fit in with the rest in the similar industry without actually emulating one specific brand. As you're crafting this primary brand color, make sure that either the dark or the light primary neutral colors that you've chosen will work with that color. So what I mean is, will either the dark or light text work on top of that color and provide a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1. That's a good rule of thumb to make sure that your text is going to be easy to read for everyone using your product. You don't have to have both the light and the dark text work on your color, but one of them must work because that's what you're going to continually use for buttons, for example. To keep an eye on these contrast ratios, I use the Stark plugin, so we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Another thing to keep in mind is that sometimes our eyes play weird tricks on us whenever we're looking at colors, where one color will look completely different on a dark background than on a light background. So sometimes you might actually have to have two versions of your brand color in order to make sure that it looks cohesive if you're using different colored backgrounds throughout your app. That's what we've done, and my team and I like to refer to these colors as toothpaste AM and toothpaste PM. Another color you might want to think about adding to your palette is some sort of alert color, and usually this is some shade of red, but it is something that you want to think about ahead of time so that you can choose a hex value that actually complements the rest of your brand colors instead of just defaulting to one later whenever you're designing different states, errors, notifications, and things like that. It should appear in very rare cases, but it is important to think about, and it doesn't always have to be red. For Bubble, we've chosen this slightly desaturated red color to use for our record buttons, as well as our error states, notifications, and a few other things. Okay, so we've talked generally about what kinds of colors you need in your color palette, but when it comes to actually choosing those and getting really specific with the hex values and the exact perfect color for your app, it's not easy. There are almost infinite colors out there, and the littlest changes can make the biggest difference. So how do you go about tweaking colors without just randomly moving around on the color wheel? That's where the HSB values come in, and this is probably the most important part of my process when it comes to choosing colors. So to do this, first choose a color that is generally what you want. For example, for me, I know that I like this green color that has a bit of blue in it. Then in your color window, switch from hex to HSB. This stands for hue, saturation, and brightness. The H value goes from 0 to 360, so it makes sense going all the way around the color wheel to actually manipulate the hue. So you can manipulate this value with a lot of specificity in order to add maybe a little bit more green or a little bit more blue to your color. Tweak the S value in order to manipulate the saturation or intensity of the color. This number goes from 0 to 100. Tweak the B number to manipulate the brightness, so adding more white or black to your color. And this value also goes from 0 to 100. Using these values and actually having an understanding of them gives you so much more control over the exact color that you're using, so I would highly recommend doing this. Okay, before we get into the implementing section, I want to talk again quickly about color perception. So I was speaking before about making sure that your contrast ratios are high enough so that the average person can read the text, but not every person perceives colors the same way. About 4.5% of the world's population have some sort of color blindness, which means that they perceive colors differently than you as the designer might. So the other cool thing you can do with the Stark plugin, along with checking the contrast, is to look at colorblind simulations. And this is not sponsored or anything. You can do this for free just by downloading the Stark plugin. And yeah, it's just really helpful to be able to see what your designs would look like to someone that has different types of color blindness. Okay, now let's talk about implementing your color palette once you have your primary and your secondary colors pretty much set. Like I mentioned before, in regards to your unique brand color, color is a great tool to use for communicating. So what I mean by that is maybe everything that is tappable is this color. Maybe all of your alerts or warnings are this color. Maybe all of your text is this color. You want to be consistent with those patterns so that people using your product can get a feel for how to interact with it. They can get used to it, and it's just easier and more usable. Okay, let's talk about background colors. So for this, you want to choose your dark or light neutral, and you want to avoid mid-tone colors, especially mid-tone colors that have a lot of saturation, because there's just going to be really hard to pay attention to any content over top of that background color if it's really jarring and calls attention to itself. Also, if it's a mid-tone color, it's going to be hard to read any dark or light text over top of it because there's not going to be a whole lot of contrast. So the question you have to ask yourself is, should you be using a light background or a dark background? And that depends on a couple things. Light backgrounds make text a lot easier to read, so think news apps and sites and things like that, while dark backgrounds really let photos and videos shine. Think like a movie theater. The other thing you might consider is whether the app will be mostly used during the day or at night. At night, it's usually better to be looking at a screen that's darker, like that has a darker background, while during the day, it's usually more comfortable to be looking at a brighter screen because the light is competing with the sunlight or the lights in your room around you. Now, of course, there are very few apps that only are used during the day or only are used at night, but there definitely are some. So think about what your product is used for, when it might be used, and if you can use this to tell you what type of background color to use. Also, something to note is that interfaces that are mostly dark use less battery because it's just less light produced by the phone. So again, nothing that is a hard and fast rule, but just some things to think about. Okay, so what about text? 99% of the time, just use your darkest or your lightest color for text, depending on the background color, of course. There are rare occasions when you might use one of your brand colors or a more vibrant color for your text, but these should be few and far between because they really stand out and they're going to look interactive, which brings me to the buttons and links and other interactive elements. So for those, that's a great time to actually use your brand color or a color, again, with more saturation to it. They're going to stand out, like I mentioned before, and so they'll look interactive and it'll be really intuitive that those are things that you can actually tap on and use within the app. The other reason to keep it simple in this way and stick with mostly neutral text and colored interactive elements is just so that the screen doesn't start to look overwhelming. You don't want to have too much going on. You want to help the user focus on what they're trying to get done and use color to lead them down that right path. This brings me to the color red. And the reason that I'm using this as an example is because it's just the most common color to use for alerts and errors and things like that because it signals to our brain to stop. This is usually used for alerts, notifications, and also caution. So let's say that you're about to delete a file and so you hit the delete button, then you want to make sure that that's actually what you want to do because that's a really sort of definitive action that could cause consequences. So you might, as the designer, want to use the color red to make sure that the person really sees this warning that this is going to be deleted for good and you won't be able to get it back. So those are some instances where you might use the color red. And of course, there's exceptions to every rule. YouTube, for example, their brand color is red. And so they use red not just for these types of alerts, but also for a lot of their other UI elements, and that seems to work. But as a general rule, I usually end up using a shade of red for these types of elements so that these small elements can stand out to the viewer when they need to. And lastly, I want to talk about opacities because you might get into a situation where you find that you don't have enough colors in your color palette to really achieve what you want in terms of the layout. So what you can do is lower the opacity of your colors that are layered on top of each other in order to add more colors to your color palette. For example, here I needed an overlay, but I didn't want to use the super light color or that would be too stark of a contrast. So I set it to my light color and then used a 10% opacity so that the dark color would mostly show through, but you can still see a definite difference between the two sections. And here I did something similar with the search bar as well. Okay friends, thanks for sticking around for this whole in-depth guide to colors. If you like this type of video, I have a whole playlist of guides that cover all different types of topics in design, so feel free to check that out. I will leave it linked below. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you all in a future video. Bye!